Do is I'm going to just introduce Rabbi Kravitz, who many of you may know that Jews have been targeted since the beginning of our existence by others to really change our opinions, to believe in other people, and it's always been a fight for many throughout our history to remain Jewish in their communities, living a life without being pestered by the churches and or friends. So in America, we're very fortunate. You can speak your mind, you can say what you believe, um, and not be persecuted for that. But at the same time, there still are people and individuals that might try to impose their beliefs on others. And there is a great organization called Jews for Judaism with the founder, Rabbi Bentzion Kravitz, who created the opportunity to help others in their own struggles and challenges. I share with anyone who wants to talk to me about Christian texts that I don't know. I don't study their texts to know the answers. So you need someone who is knowledgeable in these texts to really give the answers that are required when someone's asking. And this is what Rabbi Kravitz has devoted his life to. So he's an acknowledged authority on Judaism and Christianity. He's the founder of Jews for Judaism and is the executive director of the Los Angeles branch for Jews for Judaism. He's a renowned lecturer. He's been on television, radio, and he lectures throughout the United States, former Soviet Union, South Africa, Australia, Canada, the UK, Israel, and everyone appreciates his wisdom and his wits. So we're very honored to have him today. He is also an author of a book or a highly acclaimed booklet. He calls it a booklet, but really there's a lot of wisdom in there, called The Jewish Response to Missionaries, with over 360,000 copies in circulation to date. And it's also in English, Hebrew, Russian, Spanish, Portuguese, French, German, Chinese. Are there more languages that I missed, Rabbi Kravitz?
Just nine so
Nine.
far.
So we're very honored to have him today. He's going to share, I hope, he'll share about why he began this, more about himself, of course, and where he sees today the issues. And he is open to questions as well. So if you do have a question, write it down so you have an opportunity to ask that, or put it in the chat. We'll make sure that he is aware of those questions as well. So thank you very much. I'm going to yield the floor to you, and we really appreciate that you're with us today.
Well, thank you very much. I'm very honored to be here with everyone. Gosh, I started Jews for Judaism officially back in 1984. But I had been doing work in responding to missionaries who were targeting Jews for conversion for a number of years before that. But in 1984, I made a very major decision that this should be the number one priority of what I should be doing. I was very fortunate that I was able to actually write to my mentor, Rabbi Missionary of blessed memory, and ask him if this is where my focus should be. And I received a response, a positive response, very quickly. So I knew that this was really the area that I needed to be in. I started in the days where we would see missionaries on street corners, at universities, handing out literature. And we were very active on college campuses, helping students. Then as social media opened up, we started with one of the very first Jewish websites. Even before a lot of other organizations had websites, we were playing around with that. And I'm going to put into the notes here, I just put our website, jewsforjudaism.org. And just to give you an idea, we have over 1,100 articles there. Our YouTube channel has over 350 videos that are all free. Everything's free. So, and we just created a Hebrew area of our website because some of you may have heard that within the last couple months, there was a increased attempt to bring Christian missionary activities into Israel. And it was pretty shocking that a Christian group that has a very large cable television presence called God TV, they received a license to broadcast on cable TV in Israel 24/7 in Hebrew, and specifically with programs that were directed to share the gospel with Israelis. And we were one of many people that voiced an outrage over this. And the good news is that the authority that granted the license withdrew permission from the group. But we're left with dozens of other Christian groups that have cable TV shows that are still broadcasting into Israel. So this problem of missionaries, as our host, Rabbi Levertov, said, is not something new. Being a nation that introduced pure monotheism into the world, which was highlighted in the Torah reading for last week, where we read the 10 Commandments with the statement, I am the Lord your God. We read the Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, proclaiming God's oneness. And we also read a verse that says there's nothing else besides God. You know, those are our calling cards of who we are as a Jewish nation. That's the foundation of what we believe. Absolute, pure, unadulterated monotheism. And obviously the nations around us did not like that. It went against everything that they stood for. So there were always attempts to sway our children away from our monotheism to their beliefs. Unfortunately, we know that at different times in Jewish history, many Jews were drawn to idolatry. It always shocks me when I go to Israeli museums and I see all the statues of Canaanite idols that Jewish people were kept in their homes. I can tell you, I have a lot of things that I desire, a nice pastrami sandwich, but I have no desire for a little idol in my house. I don't have any feeling for that. So it's kind of shocking. And it's interesting because people always ask me, where do we derive a lesson that under certain circumstances, you should really be allowed to study what the other nations believe in? Because you would think that it's something that's so foreign to us that you have to stay away from it. So there's actually a very, very interesting verse, and I'm going to type it in. It's Deuteronomy Chapter 18, verse 9. Hold on a second. And you can look it up, but the verse is very interesting. The verse says, it's speaking to the Jewish people before they enter into the land of Israel. And it says, when you will enter into the land of Israel, you should not learn to do the ways of the nations that are there. And as we know, there were a number of different nations that were settled and living in that land that were given an opportunity to live in peace with the Jewish people or to leave. And only after those two options were refused by them were the Jews given permission to do battle, to conquer the land against those nations, which in and of itself is kind of a very forward-thinking approach at war that no other nations back then practiced. You didn't just give people a chance to live with you and a chance to escape. You just went in and conquered them because you wanted their strength and their power to work for you. But the verse says, when you do go and you live among these people, don't learn to do the ways of those nations. And our great sages, recognizing that every single word in the Bible has significance, that no word is superfluous, they wonder, why did the verse need to say don't learn to do the ways of the nations. It would have been sufficient to simply say, don't do the ways of those nations, or don't learn the ways of the nations. The fact that the verses don't learn to do, there's got to be an additional lesson. So the Talmud and the great sage Rashi quotes it in his commentary on this Bible verse, explains that to learn the ways of the nations around us in order to do them and to practice them, the Torah forbids us from doing that. We're not supposed to learn them in order to do them. But here comes the zinger. But to learn them so you can educate your children so that they can see how false these beliefs are in comparison to our beliefs of pure monotheism, that you're allowed to do. So it's a kind of a preventative education. You can learn it for that purpose. So many of us in the field, and there's not a lot who feel comfortable studying the texts of other religions, base our permission to do that on this verse, because we're not doing it to enhance our knowledge of Christianity as much as we're doing it so that if someone challenges someone in our community, we'll know what to answer. And this is another Talmudic statement, which you may have heard of. There in the Ethics of Our Fathers, which is, if you haven't seen it, it's one of the most amazing collections of wisdom of numerous different sages. And one of them says you should know what to answer someone who's challenging your faith. Do malatoshi. You should know what to answer. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to engage them in a debate. Knowing what the answer could simply be, I know the answer, I'm satisfied, and I'll move on. I don't have to engage them. But sometimes there is a need to engage them, because if we don't, people around us will think that Jewish people don't have an answer. And we need to stand strong and not be ashamed that we do have a Jewish response to their arguments. But as a good friend of mine, the talk show host, or Michael Medved, some of you may have listened to him. Michael Medved is a friend of mine, and he once said, too many Jewish people define themselves by what we don't believe in rather than what we do believe in. We don't believe in Christianity, so that's what makes us Jews. But that's really not how we should define ourselves. We should define ourselves by what we do believe in, our monotheism, our commitment to moral behavior, to social justice for all mankind. I love the fact that Rabbi Schneerson Lubavitcher Rebbe told some Black leaders who came to meet with him in person, he said, we're all God's children. We're all in this boat together. So that's the desire that we all need to be respectful to one another, and we need to follow a path of morality. So if we do have that commonality. So that's kind of why I started Jews for Judaism, because I saw so much money being spent by evangelical Christians. And if you had to guess how much money they spend a year, it's mind-boggling. It's anywhere from $50 to $100 million a year just to target programming and activities to try to convert Jews. And in their mind, just getting their message across and sharing it through multimedia and social media is accomplishing a goal. They're trying to spread that message. Fortunately, we have many good organizations, including Chabad, and I think Chabad has one of the most utilized websites in the world, Jewish websites. And if you haven't visited Chabad.org, the resources there are amazing. I turn to it all the time to look things up. And but we're in a battle. We're against a battle for people that want to change us, but they're not doing it simply saying, give up Judaism and become Christian. What has happened is, and probably all of you who are listening are aware, is that the approach of Christians that has unfortunately enabled them to be successful is that they evaluated what was the greatest obstacle preventing even a secular Jew from leaving Judaism and accepting Christianity. And how many of you, I can see almost all of you on the screen, how many have ever heard the statement, I was born a Jew and I'll die a Jew? Raise your hand if you heard that. So almost most people's hands are going up. So that's like a famous rallying cry among Jewish people. Don't convert me. I was born a Jew and I'll die a Jew. And if you make me into another religion, I won't be Jewish anymore. Thus, even a Jew who's not necessarily very observant doesn't want to abandon their Jewish identity. And that was always probably the greatest obstacle that Christian missionaries had to deal with, to the point that historically we know that countless Jews were willing to sacrifice their lives rather than to abandon their Jewish identity. And this was something so powerful that even non-religious Jews would not do that. So unfortunately, what the missionaries realized is that let's give Jews their cake and let them eat it too. So they created a form of Christianity that had all of the theological beliefs of Christianity, but had all of the outer garments of looking Jewish. So instead of calling their house of worship a church, they'll call it a messianic synagogue. Instead of calling their pastor or minister that, they call him a messianic rabbi. They started using these terminologies that made it Jewish. They started wearing yarmulkes. They started wearing a talit. Even though at the same time, and I caught a missionary on this once when I attended a conference of Messianic Jews in Albuquerque, New Mexico, many years ago. And I was talking to one of them, and he was wearing a yarmulke, and he was wearing tzitzis, and he got really upset that I had come to the conference to talk to Jewish people. And and I said, listen, we're only talking to people that are willing to speak to us. So he looked at me and he tried to insult me. Now, follow the logic. He looked at me. Here I am, a rabbi. I believe in God. I believe in the Torah. And he said, you, pointing to me, are only a rabbinic Jew, meaning that I only believe in the teachings of rabbis, of men. Then he pointed at himself and he said, but we are biblical Jews. We don't believe the rabbis. We only believe the Bible. We believe God. So he tried to create a level where he would be superior to the rabbis. He just goes straight to the Bible and God, but we go to the rabbis. And I looked at him and I said, let me ask you a couple questions. What's that on your head? So he very proudly, he took off his knitted kippah and he said, that's my knitted kippah, or in Hebrew we call kippah sruga, that I bought on Ben Yehuda Street in Jerusalem. So I said, okay, show me where in the Bible it says to wear a kippah. You're not going to find a verse that says that. It's a rabbinical interpretation. And then I said, I see you're wearing tzitzit. Where does it say in the Bible that they should have 8 strings and 5 knots? That's also rabbinic. And then I said, I saw Friday night that the ladies lit Shabbat candles. But instead of saying Lahadlik Ner Shel Shabbat or Shabbat Kodesh, they said Lahadlik Ner Shel Shabbat B'Shem Yeshua HaMashiach, which translates in the name of Jesus the Messiah, which really turned my stomach. But I said, show me in the Bible where it says to light Shabbat candles. And then I said, I saw that you put on tefillin Sunday morning after you had bagels and lox. I said, bagels and lox I'll give you. Everybody knows that's Jewish. But where does it say that the tefillin should be black and square? Maybe I like them to be round and orange. That's according to rabbinical teachings. So I said, you're an absolute hypocrite because you say that you are a biblical Jew and I am merely a rabbinic Jew, but everything you're doing to masquerade yourself as being authentic Jews, you're borrowing from rabbinic Judaism. And at least I can believe that rabbinic Judaism, the concept goes all the way back to the Torah when it says, and God spoke to Moses, and Moses communicated it to the Jewish people. There's a transmission of the Torah through great leaders like Moshe. And he taught it to certain people, and they taught it to certain people. And that's our rabbinic tradition. But it's all based on the foundation that it's coming from the events at Mount Sinai. But he doesn't want to accept that. But what they did is by creating these messianic synagogues and by creating their leaders as rabbis and dressing up, I call it masquerading as Orthodox Jews, they create a mindset that they haven't done anything wrong, that they haven't abandoned their Jewish identity. So if you would say to them, you're not a Jew anymore because you believe in Christianity, they'll say, no, I'm more Jewish than you. So it misleads them. And very interesting, I want to share with you a word of Torah. This idea of distorting the truth so that people will believe in something false like this is not a new idea. As far back as the book of Kings in the Bible. So after Joshua conquered the land and there were judges and then there started to be the kings over Israel. This is even before King David, in the time of Eliyahu HaNavi, Elijah the prophet. That's a long time ago. Elijah the prophet traveled to the northern part of Israel, and he was sent by God because there were a large number of Jews who were, in fact, worshiping an idol. The idol back then was called Baal. And Elijah challenges them to give up their belief. But the way he says it is incomprehensible. He says, how long will you waver between two opinions? If your God is the Jewish God, believe in him. But if your God is Baal, believe in Baal. So how can you tell Jews that they have that choice? And the answer is that these leaders who were following Baal considered themselves still Jewish. You see a Jews for Jesus t-shirt now, but if they had t-shirts back then, it would have said Jews for Baal. They thought they could be Jewish and believe in Baal simultaneously. And Elijah came and said, you can't. Be one or the other. Because when you think that you can be both, it's much more difficult to give it up. Because you deceive yourself to think that you didn't do anything wrong in the first place. And in fact, the story continues that Elijah actually demonstrated to these people that they had made a mistake and they all repented. It's a very powerful story. But this deception, this idea of diluting and changing Judaism is something very old. And the other way missionaries have done it is they love to quote our Bible as proof that Jesus fulfilled certain prophecies. And after they saw that we had answers to every one of the quotes that they gave, they started quoting things from the rabbis. Remember the rabbis that they didn't like? So they wanted to prove even the rabbis believed in it. Inevitably, every single passage they quote superficially does sound like it's speaking about Jesus. That's why they chose the verse. But also, every one of the passages they quote is usually mistranslated or taken out of context. And let me share with you one classic example. One of the most famous books in our Bible is the book of Psalms, composed primarily by King David. I'm sure you're all familiar with the book of Psalms. In Psalm 22, there's a verse, and I always tell people that if they ever are able to go stay in a hotel again after COVID is over, if you open up the nightstand next to the bed in any hotel room, there's a Bible. And if you open up the Psalm 22, verse 16, in that Bible, I'm going to tell you what it says. And without saying it out loud, you think in your mind who it sounds like, but don't say it. The verse says, dogs have surrounded me. Evil people have encompassed me. They pierced my hands and feet. Be honest. When you hear the words, they pierced my hands and feet, how many of you, the first person that came into your mind was some Jew back in Israel who was crucified? Because piercing hands and feet, we have the imagery of someone being crucified. So Christians like to quote that verse that way and show it in that Bible because it causes people to think, wow, sounds like someone being crucified. Now, does that necessarily mean it's Jesus? No. There were thousands of Jews who were crucified by the Romans, correct? It could have been anyone. So what we need to do is let's make sure the verse is really translated correctly. And it's not. The word that they translate is pierced. Are we have any Hebrew speakers with us today? Any Israelis? I don't see everybody's hand. But the Hebrew word is the word ka'ari. And ari is a lion. And ka'ari means like a lion. And what King David said in that verse was, because he was speaking about the trials and tribulations he had being pursued by the armies of King Saul, who wanted to kill him. We're all familiar with the story. King Saul was not happy with David coming to power and possibly being the next king, so he sent his armies to kill King Saul, to kill King David. So David poetically describes his feeling that he is being, dogs have surrounded me, evil people have encompassed me. He's poetically speaking about these armies that are trying to kill him. And when he says the next words, he says, they are at my hands and feet like a lion. Meaning they're about to grab him, like a lion is about to pounce on its prey. That's how terrified he feels from this. And he goes on to say that he trusts in God to protect him. By simply translating one word incorrectly and reading the verse out of context, they took a verse that's speaking about King David running from his enemies and comparing them to wild lions, to it sounding like the crucifixion, and it has nothing to do with the crucifixion. Everybody see how that works? But think about it this way. If all of you who are all, from what I see, at least over 30, right? Everybody's over 30 like me? Good. Hey, I see one over here, 35, a 37-year-old. Perfect. Okay. So we are very proud of our Jewish identity. So even if some missionary quoted us, they pierced our hands and feet, we all came to the same conclusion, many of us. It sounds like Jesus. But since we're Jewish and we're in a Jewish Zoom room, we figured there's got to be an answer, right? The rabbi's not trying to convert us, is he? But imagine our children, or even our grandchildren, who may not have the same exposure to the heritage of Judaism that we had. We remember our parents and our grandparents being very committed to being Jewish. Many of our children and grandchildren, they don't have those same memories. They never heard Yiddish spoken in the home. I fondly remember my grandmother speaking Yiddish and kept telling me in Yiddish to close the door. Matziditia, she would scream at me, close the door. And I remember it. And pictures of our Zaidi and our great Zaidi. So many kids don't have that opportunity. So if we, who are all engaged Jewishly here in this Zoom conference, could for a second hear that verse being read and think it sounds like someone being crucified, how much confusion do you think it would create in the mind of some 15-year-old Jewish kid that didn't have any Jewish experience, or perhaps has one parent who's not Jewish, who on occasion goes to church, and they start hearing these things. But when you compile that one verse with 20 or 30 other verses that do the same thing, it just creates more confusion. What's the best response to any of these verses, whether they're from the Torah, the prophets, or even if they're from rabbinical sources? It is the simplest lesson you could imagine. It's so simple, but so sad that so many young people don't use it. And we know that in college campuses, this has become a horrible problem. Young people today do not use critical thinking. They don't think things through. The proof of that is, and I think this is important, there was a professor in Seattle, Washington, who had a class of students. They were seniors, and for their final paper, he had them write a report about a newly discovered creature that was already on the endangered species list. He told them they needed to research the North Pacific tree octopus. It's an amphibious octopus that can come out of the water for short periods of time, but because of the resurgence of the American bald eagle, they would swoop down and eat all these octopi, and they were in danger. So all the students had a week to write their report. And I'm sure many of you remember in college that we wouldn't get our grades through the internet. We'd come to the door of the classroom, and a piece of paper would be posted, and everybody's name was there with the grade. And every student is standing there with their mouth dropped open because every student failed. So why did they fail? So some people will guess that the reason they failed is because there is no such thing as the North Pacific tree octopus. The professor made it up. He even created the website. If you look online, North Pacific tree octopus, you'll find a gigantic website about it. So the professor created that. But that's not the reason he failed them. He failed them because not one student quoted a second source besides that website. No one went to the U.S. government's Department of Endangered Species. None of them went to the U.S. Forest Service. None of them went to the local aquarium to do any research. They found this website and they just accepted it. That's because they took the path of least resistance. Here's the information. It's prepared for me. I don't have to think. So we know that the United States Department of Education is very concerned about the lack of critical thinking. We Jews are not like that. We embrace critical thinking. Jewish approach to study is all about critical thinking. The Talmud, one page can have 50 questions on it about one topic because we don't want to leave any stone unturned to see what's the possible answer. But the idea of critical thinking goes back even further. King Solomon. So I'm going to type it in, you can look it up. It's in the book of Proverbs, chapter 18, verse 17. Okay? King Solomon. I know you're probably familiar. King Solomon was known as a very smart king. Some even referred to him as the wisest of all men. King Solomon said, "The first to bring an argument always sounds right till someone comes and challenges him." It's a beautiful, amazing quote. It's such a deep ancient wisdom that's so applicable today. I have friends who are not religious Jews. They're not even thinking about a bar mitzvah for their son. But they wanted to do something. So I told them, start off by learning things from our ancient wisdom that are applicable to our lives today so that your son will appreciate the wisdom of Judaism. And the first one I taught him was this, because the father understood critical thinking is important, but he shouldn't think that critical thinking is being invented at Harvard University. It was invented by Jewish people and King Solomon. So this is how we should help our children and our grandchildren and friends. So if someone comes to any of you and says, you know what? I was in the market and I met this very lovely lady and she loves Israel and she cares about Israel. And she turned to me and said, you know what? Since you're Jewish, can you explain Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14, that speaks about a virgin giving birth to a child? So once again, if you hear that, it sounds like Christianity, the virgin birth. Just because the first who brings the argument makes sense doesn't mean that we don't go and get a second opinion. Who remembers one of the first lessons we taught our children when we allowed them to walk and cross the street for the first time? I know I told my kids, look both ways. Even if it's no traffic out, if it's early in the morning and there are no cars out, you should still look both ways. We go to have an operation. The doctor says we need an operation. And the doctor may have a degree from a major university, medical school. Is it a good idea or a bad idea to get a second opinion? It's a good idea. Get a second opinion, a third opinion. Someone wants to sell you a piece of property in Las Vegas, 25 acres for $25. Sounds like a great deal. Guess what? You better get a second opinion and talk to a Jewish realtor and find out if you're getting scammed. But people always, things sound good, they grab it. So this is the same thing we should do with Bible passages. Yes, the verse might sound like a virgin birth, but when we do the research, we find out that the word there doesn't mean virgin. It's mistranslated. Keep in mind that over hundreds of years, the Christian Bible developed. It didn't happen in one moment. We know that Christians speak about 4 gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But there were many other gospels that were written, many other books, and different groups of Christians only had their particular book. They found a gospel of James, but in the year 326, when Constantine was emperor of the Roman Empire, they held a council called the Council of Nicaea, and they actually decided which books should be canonized as Christianity and which were seen as blasphemous, which beliefs were not accepted. There were actually Christians who believed in Jesus but did not believe he was God. And they did not believe that you shouldn't keep the Torah. They just believed that he was the Messiah and he's going to come back. The church excommunicated them. So it didn't happen in a void. So when they looked and they translated Bible passages, they translated them in a way that would help them fit Jesus and their picture of him into the picture. There's a very famous parable by a great rabbi, the Maggid of Dubno, where they asked him why he always explains things with a parable. So he said, I'll tell you a parable. He says, there was once a guy walking through the forest, and he noticed that on every tree there was a bullseye and an arrow right in the middle. And he was curious, who's the great marksman who always gets an arrow right in the middle? So he wanders into the village and he asks around, and they say, well, the only one with a bow and arrow is this guy over here. And he sees this guy, he doesn't look very athletic. And he says, are you the one that shot all the arrows in the bullseye? He said, absolutely. He says, can you tell me how? He says, I'm not going to tell you here. Let's go into the forest and I'll tell you. He says, here's my secret. First, I shoot the arrow at the tree, and then I draw the circle around it. So what some missionaries have done is not what we do. We have a Torah that creates a beautiful picture of what our expectations are about our belief in God, our belief in Torah, or even our belief in a messianic redeemer. And in order for someone to fulfill that, he has to fit in the middle. He has to fulfill it. What many missionaries do is they put Jesus in the middle, like an arrow, and they say, this is who we want to believe. Now let's go find passages that can fulfill it. They didn't need to have a belief that Jesus was born of a virgin, except they wanted to believe that all people are born in sin through human intercourse. We're born inheriting sin. So since they wanted to make everybody sinful, they had to figure out a way to get Jesus out of having that problem. So boom, he's born of a virgin. And guess what? Do you think Christians were the first ones to believe in gods who were born of virgins? No, the Greeks and Romans had that in their mythology. My wife Devorah and I, a number of years ago, we stayed in Israel for 3 weeks in Jerusalem. And we used to like to walk around this outdoor mall called Ben Yehuda. And we're walking, and my wife, I noticed 2 young teenage Israeli girls speaking to someone, and it just didn't seem right. And I go over and I listen. I was right. It was a missionary speaking to the 2 girls, and they didn't know how to excuse themselves and get away from him. So I'm listening. And this missionary looks up at me and he says, are you a rabbi? And I said, what gave it away? Was it the beard? Was it the yarmulke? He says, yeah, you're a rabbi. Are you going to beat me up? I said, why would you say that? Well, he says, well, they told me that if I share the gospel, the rabbis are going to beat me up. I said, no, I'm not going to beat you up. I think we have a lot in common. Boy, his face brightened and shining. We have something in common. What do we have in common? So I was playing with him a little bit. So I said, you know what? I believe that God got a human woman pregnant. She had a son. The son was God in a body, and he had great powers, and he came to save the world. Boy, the guy went crazy. He couldn't believe it. So he quickly says, and what was the guy's name? What was his name? So I said, Hercules. Because he said, but he looks at me and says, but that's a Greek myth. I said, yeah, I know. It's a Greek myth that Apollo caused the human woman to become pregnant, and Hercules was God and man in a body with great super strength. He says, yeah, but that's a Greek myth. I said, what language was the New Testament written in? And when he said Greek, his mouth dropped and he couldn't say anything else. And I was trying to point to him that the influence, the changes from the pure monotheism that we believe in, based on the Shema, based on the first of the 10 commandments, based on the verse in last week's portion that says there's nothing else besides God, that God transcends time and space. Those are our beliefs. The beliefs in a Trinity, that God takes on a bodily form, those all predated Christianity and were in Greek mythology. And in Roman paganism. And that's where Christianity flourished. It flourished under the Roman Empire. And it's only recently that these missionaries are bringing it back and trying to make it look Jewish. So what we did and what I started was an organization called Jews for Judaism. Why did I name it Jews for Judaism? Because back in the 80s, when I started it, the biggest missionary group that I was concerned about was Jews for Jesus. So I said, okay, you're Jews for Jesus. We're Jews for Judaism. And the name really took off. And eventually we focused on offering counseling to parents, grandparents, individuals who have been confronted by a missionary or maybe even confused into believing what the missionaries say. And we meet privately. Now we meet over Zoom, and I have numerous Zoom counseling sessions every week. Even many non-Jews who are realizing that they want to not believe in Christianity anymore because they see that it's full of problems and they want to become Jewish. But we also created, like I mentioned earlier, our website, JewsForJudaism.org, which has hundreds and hundreds, I shouldn't say it, more than 1,000 articles that we're constantly adding to. And then what's really amazing is if you know how to access YouTube, if you go to YouTube and type in Jews for Judaism, you'll see that we have what's called a YouTube channel for Jews for Judaism, and we have over 350 lectures on all kinds of topics that most other Jewish organizations, that's not their focus. And I know many organizations, whether it's Chabad or Aish Torah or Sameach, they refer people to our website because we're dealing with topics that's our specialty. So I want to invite all of you to take advantage of our resources, to contact me. I'm going to type my email address here. Make sure I did it right. Oh, type Judaism wrong. I always do that. Okay, there's my email address. Any of you that have questions, anyone that you know someone that needs or would like to meet with me or talk to me over Zoom, happy to set up a consultation or a counseling session. And I think, Rabbi, I've been talking now 45, almost 50 minutes.
So do you have time for questions?
I think questions would be good. Okay.
First of all, thank you so much for sharing all that background and really the eye-opening methods. And I liked how you said critical thinking. And there's a comment actually where I'm going to read it because I think it's good for everyone to hear this. You had mentioned how it's so much more difficult for our children who don't have that. They didn't grow up with the heritage the way many of us did, so they don't have that within them to the appreciation. Born a Jew, dying a Jew. So this is just from Judy. She wrote, their children are bombarded with the BDS, J Street, annexation versus sovereignty, Israel's right to exist, historical distortations, and therefore they have so many things that they already don't like or are grappling with. This is just one more thing that maybe pushes them over the edge. Those are my additional words. But if anyone does have a question, please either use the chat. If it's in the chat, I'll make sure to read it. If you don't want to write it with your name, send it to me privately. And of course, you can unmute your microphone to ask a question.
And I would just to say something. This lesson of King Solomon about critical thinking is so important and fundamental to who we are. It's something that could help a student that goes off to colleges and confronted by arguments of BDS or Antifa or all these beliefs. Maybe some of their arguments make sense, but we don't just accept everything without exploring it and examining it and seeing the facts. And I think that has become the biggest problem our young people are confronted with today. They just jump to conclusions without doing research. They don't want to take the time to do work. They go on their phone and they say, okay, did Israel take away the land from the Palestinians? They type that in and boom, 100 websites that say they did. But they don't keep searching for the ones that explain how those arguments are not correct. So we need to teach our kids that the importance of that, of research, and that the effort is worth the reward. Okay, so I'm happy to take questions.
Yeah, and again, if anyone has a question, please unmute your mic. I may as well ask you, since when we spoke, I think last week, what is the mechanism currently that you find that younger people are being approached?
When you say
random cold, yeah. Are you saying a random cold meeting on the street, or it's differently?
I would say two things. Most successful contacts are done through an acquaintance, someone that they meet, not through a professional missionary who is out handing out brochures or wearing a t-shirt that says he believes in Jesus, because the minute you see that, your guard goes up. It's usually from someone that you met who was an acquaintance, a relative of someone that you know, someone you're in business with. So you don't have any reason to suspect them. You already have some kind of rapport that you're talking to them. And you don't want to insult them and say, no, I don't want to just shut you off. Listen, if a missionary walks up the street, it's easy. Say, leave. I don't want to talk to you. But if it's someone that you've been in business with, and let's say you've been taking your car for repair to a mechanic shop for the last 10 years, and you know the mechanic, and one day he turns to you and he starts talking to you about something. Think about how much more difficult it is to just walk away from that person. Or a student who's in a class, and the professor, after months of teaching the student, asks the student a question. So it's usually going to happen more through people that have built up some kind of relationship and friendship. And today we see that there are people that go into senior citizens' homes, even though with COVID that's very difficult. But there are people that go in to befriend people that are in a closed setting, but then they build up a friendship with them, and then they can talk to them. But now on social media, look, I'm speaking to people, and I can see people that I've never met before, and you all look like great people that it would be friends. I'd love having you as my friends. Okay? And by the way, I send out a weekly spiritual insight every week. And it's a little twist on the portion. It's always trying to take something from the portion that will give us a tool to respond to missionaries. So it's kind of unique. So if you email me and ask to be put on that mailing list, I'll add you that each week you'll be sent automatically that spiritual insight.
And I will, I'll include the email address in our email on Wednesday, so people have that handy.
Okay.
Here's a question that came from the chat. What denominations are into missionary work, and as well, what organizations are behind Jews for Jesus? Meaning, is it one organization or multiple?
Okay, so the denominations that are primarily behind missionary activity, Christian missionary activity, are the Southern Baptists and most evangelical Christians. And even though we know that evangelical Christians on some levels are very good friends of the state of Israel, and they give financial support and political support, not everything that the evangelicals teach is something that every Jew accepts. I'm talking not about religious, about Christianity. For example, there are many liberal Jews who don't agree with evangelicals' stance on abortion. And even Orthodox Jews have a problem with evangelicals who say that under no circumstance at any point in the pregnancy should there be an abortion. That's not what Jewish law says. Jewish law says that if a woman's life is in danger and that during the early part of pregnancy, that under certain circumstances an abortion would be acceptable. So we also have a problem with some of the teachings of evangelicals. But because the evangelicals are supporting Israel financially and politically, they have been able to make great inroads into setting up house, so to speak, in Israel and doing missionary activity. But it's mostly coming from the evangelical Christian community and the Southern Baptists. It's not really coming from the Catholic Church. We don't really see Catholics having a big focus on let's go convert the Jews. So we see that the Mormon Church is very into proselytizing, but not specifically Jews. They'll try to bring anyone to the Mormon Church, but I believe that they're a lot less successful because the Mormons didn't create a movement called Jews for Mormonism. And I want to say this last point because I think it's very, very important. I said earlier that one of the tactics that the missionaries used that helped them to be successful is that they portray Christianity as being Jewish in the way it's practiced and the way it's believed. And it used to be back in the 70s and 80s, the only missionaries that said that were Jews for Jesus. But that method, it became so clear to the evangelical church that it's successful, that if we were a fly on the wall inside an evangelical church, and the question was asked, should we allow Jews to come into the church and continue to practice their holidays and wear a yarmulke if they want? 50 years ago, you know what the answer would have been in most churches? No. But now they all tell them, yes, keep your Jewish heritage. So that is how it's spread. And that's primarily in all of these evangelical churches, that they all think like that. And that's what made it much worse, because it doesn't have to be a missionary. It doesn't have to even be a Jew for Jesus. The other part of your question was, who supports them?
Well, specifically, I mean, you can answer both, but specifically behind Jews for Jesus as well.
I don't think it's any one organization. They're a specific organization, but they're soliciting money from, there's 60 million evangelical Christians in America. 60 million. That's a lot of people to solicit. I'll give you an example. When the missionaries tried to when they launched their campaign to be on cable TV in Israel, I launched a campaign through an organization called the Chesed Fund to raise some money to translate articles into Hebrew. With all the advertising I did, I only raised a few $1,000s through that campaign. At the same time, a missionary group in Israel called One for Israel launched a campaign, and in 2 days they raised $1 million. So if we're gonna, dollar for dollar, I'm not gonna beat them. It has to be quality and word of mouth. It's sad. They have much more money than we have, and we can't expect that other organizations in the Jewish community, where their focus is on pro-Jewish education, like Chabad, is going to put their money into counter-missionary work. That's not the focus. So it leaves us, we're just a few people in Jews for Judaism. I'm here in LA, and we have, with my son, and we have 2 people in Toronto. That's it. Fighting a multi-million-dollar evangelical campaign. The good news is that every time we add things to our website, it's there for perpetuity, for people to access. Okay? I'm just going to turn the fan on in the room.
Okay.
Sorry.
So a question that came to me, first of all, a question in the chat. Someone wants to know about contributing to Jews for Judaism. I assume they go to your website. There's a donate page.
Thank you for asking the question. I wasn't going to push it, but if you go to Jews for Judaism, up in the top right corner, there's a button for donate, and you can donate through the website.
So I have a question. Are the public debates a thing of the past? Do those still happen?
Not really. The missionaries want debates because they film it and they publicize it and they edit it in a way that makes them look like the winners. Our organization was always opposed to debates. We believed that it did more damage, that it gave them publicity they didn't deserve. And I stand by that position. Certain people are debated, and they were being paid by the missionaries. How can that be a fair debate just because they have the term rabbi before their name? They were doing it because it gave them publicity and it got them out in the public eye. That's not what this is about. So you're not gonna convince people in a debate, because a debate really becomes two monologues. Then it's not really a dialogue. So we were never involved in it. We refuse all the time when they ask us to debate.
That makes sense. Thank you. Are there any other questions? I know that everyone is silent today. If anyone does have a question, and while you are thinking if you have a question, you had mentioned that you work a lot one-on-one. Is that something that you charge for, or how does that work?
So our policy was to never have an official charge for two reasons. One, we never wanted to create a situation where someone couldn't come to us for help because they couldn't afford it. That's number one. We also didn't want to make it difficult for them to come to us for help. We also don't want the individual, maybe someone's child, to think, hey, you're just doing this for the money, right? You don't really care about me. You're just doing it for the money. So we don't do it officially. What we ask of people who somehow utilize our services is that they should consider being participants and partners with the organization and supporting it. And I've always found that to be a much more tactful and polite way of doing it. And then other people who are blessed with not needing our help, that's the blessing we want for everyone. You should never need us, right? But they say, listen, I feel bad for other people that do need the help, and I want to help support what you're doing. The biggest donation we ever got, ever, from someone, I don't want to say the amount, but it was really big. The woman that gave it attended one of our banquets, and she heard a mother and daughter speak. And the daughter spoke about how she was an actress in Hollywood, and she was in a horrible car accident and in a coma. And when she woke up from the coma, all of her friends were around her bed, and they were all Christians, and they were praying for her, and they started saying how Jesus helped her, and she got pulled into that. And the mother contacted me, never charged them a penny, never took a dime from them. They would come every week and study with me. And eventually I helped them. So they spoke at the banquet about their experience. This woman who happened to be there, after the banquet, she wrote this gigantic check. And when I went to thank her, because I didn't expect it, I said to her, first name was Ruth. I said, Ruth, why did you write a check like this? She said, I don't want any other parent to have to ever go through the pain that mother went through. And if I can help you, that you can help other people, that's what I want to do. So fortunately, we have people that their support enables us to do this. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, no, thank you. And if I don't see any other questions, if someone does have a question, now would be the time.
Can I get a thumbs up? Did I do okay today?
Yes, they can
like it. Yeah. Okay. How many of you had heard of Jews for Judaism before? No, most. Oh, a few people. Yeah. Good. Great. Very nice. Well, I'm glad that more people know about it. My blessing to you is that you should never need me. But if you do, now you know where to go, right?
Absolutely.
That's what I want. Okay, everyone. I want
Rabbi
to wish
Kravitz,
you.
Thank you.
I want to wish you good health and happiness. And as we get closer to the new year, God should bless us that the masks are removed, the disease is removed, and we're able to gather in our congregations together as a community and enjoy our Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur together.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you all.
Thank you again, Rabbi Kravitz. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye, everyone.